Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel, Literature and the Global Imaginary. I'm joined on stage by Mohsin Hamid, Ece Temelkuran, and Parul Sehgal. Let me introduce the panel. By the way, lovely to see so many of you here, given that there's a petting zoo on the lawn right now. Kind of lucky you didn't lose me. Mohsin Hamid on my left-hand side. Mohsin is an acclaimed British-Pakistani author known for creative fiction and commentary that address contemporary global issues. His most recent novel, The Last White Man, explores the cultural, social, and political dynamics of race. Exit West, about migration and the refugee experience, received the 2017 Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction. His book, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, an exploration of issues of religion, politics, and identity in a globalizing world, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and later adapted into a successful film. Mohsin's engagement with themes of political turmoil, cultural displacement, and shifting individual and collective identities informs his influential essays on contemporary affairs in leading outlets, including The Guardian, New York Times, and Paris Review. That's the official biography, let me add. Mohsin lives in Lahore, where he helped establish the Lahore Literary Festival, an annual event with the explicit aim of exploring the interface between literature and the arts that shape Lahore, and by extension, Pakistan's cultural, social, economic and political frameworks, which I think is particularly pertinent to our discussion today. His novels Exit West and The Reluctant Fundamentalist were both selected as Georgetown Fresher Common Reads, and so presumably live in the global imaginary of at least some Georgetown students. Ece Temelkuran is a Turkish novelist, a political thinker, and a leading analyst of the erosion of democracy and the challenges of populism on a global scale. Her most recent book, Together, 10 Choices for a Better Now, makes a compelling case for secular faith as a driver of solidarity and transformative change. It follows closely on her acclaimed How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. Ece's 2 previous books explore the Turkish-Armenian divide and Turkey's cultural and political crises. A frequent contributor to The Guardian, New York Times, Le Monde, and other leading outlets, she's the recipient of the PEN Translates Award and the Freedom of Thought Award from the Human Rights Association of Turkey. In 2023, she received the El Mundo Award for her body of work. Ece has described 10 Choices as a response to How to Lose a Country. Not about how we are messing up, but an attempt to imagine what kind of world we want to live in now. And of the book itself, Brian Eno said, "If I had to choose just one book that I want everybody of any age to read at this moment in time, this would be it." Parul Sehgal. Our 2 writers are joined by a critic, Parul Sehgal. Parul is a staff writer at The New Yorker. Before that, she was a book critic at The New York Times, where she also worked as a senior editor and columnist. She's won awards for her criticism from the New York Press Club, the National Book Critics Circle, and the Robert B. Silvers Foundation. She teaches in the Graduate Creative Writing program at New York University. And let me add, of Parul, one of her New Yorker pieces caught the imagination of the literary world last year. It was titled The Tyranny of the Tale. We're told that story will set us free, but what if a narrative frame is also a cage? And that's something we'll definitely get to later. Let me tell you a bit about myself. My name is Aminatta Forna. I am the Lannan Director here at Georgetown University, Director of the Lannan Center. I'm also a writer of fiction and non-fiction. So I hope you don't mind if I take part in the discussion too, as well as leading it. We're here to discuss whether literature can help us out of the impasse of polarized public discourse that we seem to have found ourselves in. We have an hour for the discussion, followed by 30 minutes for questions from you. There are note cards available somewhere in the aisle. Anyone see note cards? I am asked to ask you to write your questions on a note card and pass them to the outer edges of the aisle so that somebody can collect them and bring them to the stage. Panelists. Can we begin? I'd like to begin by defining our terms a little bit. Parul, I'm going to start with you. What to you does the term global imaginary mean?
Not a term I think of often or use. And I was thinking, you told me that we would define our terms, and automatically I said, why do they have to be our terms to begin with? Already getting a little bit. But when I think about global imaginary, I do think of it as the sort of web of consciousness that might unite us, that we participate in creating, that writers are involved in interrupting its cliches, and can contribute to making together. I think that's how I use it. But again, it's not a word, it's not a term that I use often. And I think that I'm going to be interested in unpacking it and making it smaller and more portable and monkeying with it a little bit today.
It's not a phrase I have ever used, actually, which is why I was interested in finding a way to talk about this. So it's a collective consciousness. Is that something you agree with, Mohsin? And you've talked about the dangerous binary that we're caught in, which is part of our discussion today. And you have said machine thinking is binary thinking. There's a kind of sorting impulse that has come into being today, presumably because of the advent of technology. Could you talk a little bit about that? Is this global imaginary something new, always existed, changed shape?
So I have to admit, I also have never used the term before, but that's never stopped me from speaking, authoritatively on a subject. So I think, in a sense, it's interesting to just look at those two words, right? Global, imaginary, and I will approach it with my own sorting mechanism. Global, good, bad, more good than bad for me. Mm-hmm. Imaginary, very good.
I like that.
Now, it's funny because not everybody will feel the same way. Imaginary also is untrue. You made it all up. So I think I land on the side of, quite pro-global-ish, very pro-imaginary-ish. But I don't think it really matters. I think what winds up happening is we get a couple of words, and then we can decide whether we are, protagonists or antagonists, to those words, which is to your point around the sorting mechanism. So we have now lived, and those who are my age, I'm 52. I grew up, without a smartphone, without internet, in much of my childhood in Lahore, basically without TV. A little bit of TV. And so I've been watching, I guess, our experience of coming to unify with machines. We now live this sort of cyborg existence. My children, having known my share of drug addicts in my life, my children are profoundly addicted to their devices. And they have a real, they're enmeshed. And I think, most of us have become enmeshed in our devices. And I think the result of that is it's like when you immigrate someplace, or you marry someone, or you start dating somebody, or you have this day-to-day thing, and you start becoming transformed. And the point of this binary is, what does it mean to be transformed? So if we are now immigrants in the land of machines, or if the machines are the migrants in the land of human, I think maybe more former than the latter, but could be the other way around. What has our cultural contact resulted in? My own sense is that we can see our way of thinking being affected. I was affected when I moved to California at the age of 3. I was affected when I moved back to Pakistan at 9. When I came to a liberal arts college in America at 18. Each of these things has affected me. And I think the exposure to machines has affected us. And the way it's affected us, my sense is that machines have a way of thinking. Machines effectively proceed through a series of sorting actions. 0, 1. Is it this, that? Is global good, bad? Is imaginary good, bad? And then you start going down this thing. It's possible we will later discover that humans think exactly in the same way, and some scientists will watch this video and say, look at these apes, talking about primitive understanding of the mind. But my sense is that that's not the case. I don't know if human beings do think in this 0-1 binary sorting system. I think human beings very often encounter something and are kind of like, who knows? Maybe, both, neither, I'm not sure, that space. And so my sense of what's been going on is that we are now entering into a cultural domain because of our encounter with machines where we are being encouraged to have a machine-like sorting to almost anything we face. Are you like me? Not like me. And we can now engage in increasingly fine gradations of this thing. So, okay, you seem to be like me, but what do you think about this? Okay, that's still like me. What about this? What about this? Not like me. Okay, you are not like me. I'll stop there, but my sense of it is that that there is something profoundly at odds with what it used to mean to be human, to have this particular cultural intrusion in the form of a way of thinking. And we see manifestations of it in everything around us.
That's interesting. And can I pick that up with Ece? What Mohsin seems to be saying is that one person's global imaginary is another person's world-class lie. I suppose that's one way of putting it. But also that it is that technology is continually dividing and potentially subdividing us, but continue dividing us. And that isn't the way we think. Can you talk to me a little bit about your experience? We're in a period of particular global upheaval at the moment. From Syria, ISIS pandemic, through Gaza, Ukraine, Congo, Sudan. And I think I'm right in saying that writers are feeling particularly vulnerable at the moment, and that has been that feeling of vulnerability is exacerbated by the internet because of what is called cancel culture. And I just wonder, has that changed in any way your thoughts about your own ethical responsibilities as a writer? And your experience, of course.
I was feeling lucky that you're not asking me what is global imaginaries. And now I am not feeling so lucky at all. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here with these two amazing people and with you all. I'm learning the art of evading questions with stories from Mohsin. So let me tell you a story. Right. Well, actually, it's related. That's why I'm telling the story. At least not to the ethical question that you asked, which we can also discuss, but to the global imaginary. Yesterday in a panel, I mentioned this a little bit. I'm a daughter of a painter and the lawyer, and my mother was a leftist who was imprisoned in one of the coup d'etats in Turkey, and my father, as a young lawyer, rescued her, and then they got married and so on. So when I was growing up, the first book my mom read to me was called Little Black Fish. It is from an Iranian writer. I don't know if anyone knows about this guy. He's amazing. He was an amazing writer, Samet Behrengi. So the little black fish story is, in my part of the world, by the way, this story is quite popular. Speaking of global matters, nobody knows about this in the United States, probably. Little black fish is in a small river, and then she wants to go to the big sea, and she goes to the big sea with a knife in her pocket, And then she goes through it, adventures, challenges, and so on and so forth. And then she comes back. She tells all these amazing stories to to her family, to her friends, and everybody falls in love with her. This is the first book I was read. So you can see how it actually wrote my destiny, which I did. I mean, I'm constantly on the big sea stories and trying to get back to home and so on. The problem is, when I was, let's say, around my 30s, for the first time as an adult, I saw this book and I took it. I said, yeah, this is the first book my mom read to me. And I went through it. Guess what? The story doesn't end like that. The story ends like this. And then nobody heard from the little black fish. So my mother actually changed the ending of the story. And I felt my entire life has been shaped because of this. Anyway, I was a journalist for 20 years. I did journalism until Mr. Erdogan decided that I shouldn't anymore. So I was in Tahrir when Tahrir was happening, Arab Spring was happening. So I went to the apartment of the leaders, organizers of Tahrir. And I saw the same book, Little Black Fish. And this guy turned out to be a Palestinian, and his father was the Palestinian publisher of Blackfish, Little Black Fish. So we got really excited about this. A few years later, I'm in Madrid. And I bought this book for a friend's child. And I was supposed to read the book as a bed story. And of course, what I did was to change the end of the story. And I thought about this. Actually, this is a chapter in Together. I told this story in Together. Why did I do this? I mean, am I creating another naive, stupid person like myself? Or am I actually changing the reality? Because we are thinking of Tahrir now. All those believed in another ending. In several times during the human history came together to do stuff, and sometimes we actually changed the ending. So we are actually creating, through stories, possible endings, better endings. And then if enough people believe in these better endings, the actual endings can really change. To believe in this is to believe in human, is to believe in global imaginary. By the way, this was a quite global story, I think, Turkey, Tahrir, Madrid, and so on. So this is how I see literature and its ethics, actually.
And that does answer the question about the ethical responsibilities.
Yeah.
Parul, I'm going to come to you, but I would like to ask Mohsin too whether, as a writer, his sense of his ethical responsibilities has shifted at all since you began writing, I guess, actually. What changes do you see over the years?
I was never sure what my ethical responsibilities were, and I still
Well,
don't
now's your
exactly.
chance.
I don't know. I don't know what they are. I situate them really in the global imaginary, but I think it's easier to talk about one's relationship. I completely agree with what Ece was just saying, which is in a sense, at some fundamental level, to be a human being is to be composed of stories, right? We have a kind of scientific understanding of what we are, which is this cellular thing with, molecular biology, organic chemistry, neurons firing. We're kind of this machine ourselves. But that's not how most of us understand ourselves or our world or what we want or what could be. All of that is stories. Now, then you say, okay, well, if stories are the fundamental basis on which we make sense of things and ourselves and the world, then the question is, what is the ethics of storytelling? Is you can't separate that from what is the ethics of just being a human being. And in that case, in terms of what are the ethics of being a human being, it's sort of, who knows? You're figuring it out as you go along. When I was a kid, stories were very attractive to me as a way, as sort of a place to go. I would read stories, and more than read stories, I would play make-believe and just sort of have elaborate fantasies. And, and that was part of what it was to be a little Mohsin, I suppose, at the age of 6 or 8 or, even older. My son would often come, in the form of a deadly T-Rex, to my study, roaring, and fixing me with his killer gaze when he was 7, and I would sort of, sit there terrified, secretly relieved because I'd been procrastinating, but actually, also terrified. And he would look at me, and he wasn't playing a game, in a sense. He was a T-Rex. And there was an incredible ferocity and danger and scale in this little 7-year-old child. And he was embodying those things. And he needed me to react, appropriately, which I tried to do. It was actually pretty terrifying, in fact, most of the time. And so, and then he would stomp off to his next victim in the house. And why was he doing this? Why do we do this? We enter into stories as children, and both of my kids, do this and continue to do this, and I continue to do this. I'm always fantasizing about, something. For me, so much of the attraction of storytelling was that it was, escape is not the right word. It was an opportunity to attain a certain degree of authorship over my life. That I could write myself into existence, right? I could write the world into existence in the way I wanted it to be. And I won't go further than that, but I think, in a sense, what does that mean as one's ethics?
Responsibility.
And responsibility, I think it does come down to trying to ask oneself, what does one want to author? And then, I suppose the responsibility is, how does one do that? And that hasn't changed. And so, in a way, I'm still trying to write into existence these things, whether it's in the novels that I write or essays, but also, just in my dreamings and imaginings. And I do think that in that sense, leaving aside whether we're all novelists, we may not all be novelists, but we are all storytellers. And in that sense, we are all engaged in this ethical practice of what is the world that we wish to author into being.
Of course, and when you write yourself into existence, you are also writing a lot of other people into existence, or they will see themselves there. So, I'd like to ask Parul, there's a writer, Helen Habila, who's a Nigerian writer, and Helen once told me a story about the day that he told his mother he wanted to be a writer, and his mother burst into tears. And she burst into tears not because she, worried that he wasn't going to pay the rent or ever hold down a job or have children or healthcare. She burst into tears because they lived in Nigeria and she assumed that he would go to prison, right? That was what came with being a writer. And I am interested in this because we all represent different parts of the world in various ways, culturally or because of the passports we hold or where we've lived. But I kind of figured out that the only place we don't have represented on the stage, fully represented on the stage, is South America, but we've pretty much got everywhere else. There's one of our university professors here, the poet Caroline Forchet, who was in the audience, wrote about being taken as a young woman to El Salvador by an activist. And he took her around and he showed her what was happening in El Salvador. And he said to her, well, you must go back and write about this. And she said, well, why me? I'm a poet. You need a journalist, right? And he said, no, people listen to poets. Now, that would probably come as a surprise to a lot of people in the Western world, but certainly in the part of the world that I come from, people listen to poets. right? People listen to writers. So I'm interested in this question of when we write, you know, we must therefore be in some way aware of where our stories land. And I just wonder, Parul, if you could talk a little to that.
Yeah, no, I can, because I think this ties into some of my loving but gentle skepticism of story, you know, is that, you know, story is something that has been ascendant at a particular time in history. For much of history and in many of our cultures, sitting here, it was poetry, it was the lyric. Even now in my family, if you have any problem and you make the mistake of asking my parents, they will look up into some distance and start reciting some ghalib to you, you know? Automatically, it's just there, it's what they reach for. It's how they understand themselves, it's how they understand emotion. I think learning to read was less important, even in my house, than learning to memorize poetry. And it was something to have. It was something that you're going to keep in your pocket and you're going to need it. So in that sense, I think some of that, you know, some of that has shaped my own understanding of what story can do, what story cannot do. I think also, I mean, we've shared 2 childhood stories, so I feel entitled to share mine. So I also grew up like dreadfully addicted, right, and enmeshed, but not with devices. My sister and I were the most horrendous book thieves you can imagine. And we just were obsessed with novels. It's some good novels, most of them not good novels, but we were just of that time, especially in India, when you could just like at the train station get all of these lurid paperbacks, and we were just forever in one book or the other, and it was a huge problem in my family, you know? There were interventions, like, you cannot believe that this is reality. I think the children think this is real. And we were like, we 100% believe this is real, you know? So there is this historic fear also of stories, and especially of children reading fiction, right? For a long time, American public education was obsessed with how do we contain, frame fiction, how do we get boys away from reading these dreadful dime novels, right? So fiction has also had this very complicated history. As much as we can write our own selves into stories, invariably we are writing certain people out, right? We are doing an act of curation. Certain details become muffled, certain become louder. And I think that these are some of the things that I find interesting about story, just because I feel by virtue of some of this background, I'm self-conscious about story, you know, in this way, because it was this thing, this very dangerous element in the household, and wasn't as clean and sort of as prescribed as poetry was necessarily. But I think the other thing, and this is kind of off topic, but maybe, I don't know, slightly on topic, in the sense that, like, what is it that story allows us to see and do? I would love to ask all of you at some point.
Right?
We're going
to dig deep into that.
Yeah, can we? All right, so maybe I'll wait for us to dig there. Maybe, yeah, I'll bring up my question there when it comes to like actually.
What are the limitations of story?
What does it allow us to see? You know, that we can't. Like, what does a narrative actually surface for us that the lyric can't, or the news report can't? Right? Why is the New York Times, for example, saying that they're changing their mandate and it's no longer a news organization but a collection of juicy narratives? What does that mean?
Well, let's talk a bit about America before we go into story, because, you know, what I'm trying to get out of the three of you is really, you know, how books and narrative and authors, poets are perceived in the lands from which in which you are currently situated. I mean, I've been to the Lahore Literature Festival, and I remember being asked by a man in the audience, after I'd finished reading and my interview, and a man in the audience said, "Madam, could you please tell me what the lessons are for Pakistan from your book?" Now, that is not a question I've ever been asked in America, right? I mean, not about Pakistan, but America. No one has ever said, what are the lessons for America from your book? So it's a very different reading public, I find, a very, very different reading public. So I would like to explore that, but let me quote Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, a quote I found, I loved it actually. He says, author of Faust, he said, "The decline of literature indicates the decline of a nation." in a sense that a nation gets the literature it deserves. And I wonder if that's something you would comment on, Ece.
Oh, definitely. You know, you called me a novelist, but then you talked about the political books. And once you write about political stuff, nobody wants to remember that you're a novelist because politics is so juicy. And it's sexy in its own way. And it never stops. It's like a roller coaster. So, yeah. However, I also written novels. But then let me tell you this. How to Lose a Country, the book you mentioned, it's about the global patterns of fascism, new fascism. How fascism comes into a country in an embryonic form and then grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And there are 6 steps. And one of the steps, actually, very early on, it begins with the fear of words. You don't feel it. It just happens in rooms like this. But then suddenly a word becomes like, let's not talk about that. Or not even that, like it just creates this eerie silence. And then you start fearing of words. Then you start losing the words. The problem is we think with words and we imagine with words. So people's communication alters, and then the writing changes, and so on. And this happened in Turkey, and I see it happening in this country as well, and in other European countries as well. The thing is, fear is the mother of really, really evil things. And I think we have to find a humane way to address these fears. Of course, literature is the way to do it. And you talk about journalism, novels, poetry, people listen to poets and so on. I think all literature is poetry. It's just you dilute it. Some, it becomes essay, and then you dilute some more, it becomes novel. And then you dilute more, it becomes journalism. But at the end, it is all poetry, and it has this massive power, actually. And stories have that power. It is so powerful that throughout the human history, the only reason people killed each other was because there were different stories. They believed in different stories. And they believed in different pasts. They remembered the past differently. And the only way to bring these stories together is literature. Can it do it? I mean, that is the limitation. Can it change the world? Can it change the humans? That's another problem, but it can bring the stories together. And if we are talking about some ethics or moral responsibility, and I'm on old school, I believe in moral responsibility, to be honest, that is the ethical responsibility to bring the stories together and to make people not kill each other, basically.
Let me ask Mohsin then, what do you see when you look at the United States? What stories do you hear? And do you believe that writers can tell a story that would bring people together? Briefly.
This is where poets have such an
stories you
advantage.
see?
You can just a haiku and it's done. I want to just react to what
Sure.
Ece and Parul both said, and then jump into this. I think that to what Parul was saying, I don't think that the novel, of course, is the only way in which we have story. Yeah. We have many great storytellers in my family, and only one of them is trying to be a novelist. So there are many other forms of storytelling, and storytelling will continue. The novel may or may not continue. The novel is a particular thing. Storytelling will continue, and it'll take different forms. It has taken different forms, and it'll evolve. So I'm speaking in a way more of storytelling than I am of novels, specifically. To Ece's point, which is that fear enters the room. Now, unfortunately, fear also enters the room. The day that we stop being aquatic organisms and come out into this cold, air, right? The day that we leave our mothers, we are scared. Something profoundly weird and uncomfortable and wrong has happened to us. And we live our lives, at least partly, afraid. Now, as we begin to figure out what we're afraid of, there's many things for us to be afraid of. But one of the things that we are afraid of is time. Time kills all of us. And time brings things to us. Time, of course, has all possibility and beauty and whatever else, but it's also terrifying. When we engage in storytelling, we attempt to take control of time. We construct a narrative that has perhaps its own internal time. We emerge from within the stream of time to this sort of new place where we are determining the time, or we're just not conscious of time passing as we write. The storytelling impulse is also very substantially one of the ways in which human beings, I would say, perhaps the primary, but one of the important ways in which we inoculate ourselves against our terror. So when fear comes into the room, as it does in Turkey, has always been in Pakistan, I can't remember a time when it wasn't in the room.
Don't get into competition with
Yeah, exactly. We can do this afterwards. But it is out of fear that so much amazing storytelling actually happens. The tradition of Sufi poetry, is pretty much born when Mansur al-Hallaj is, crucified. An early Sufi saint is crucified and then burnt, sort of double up on the punishment for making this pronouncement, which in a sense translates to "I am God." And that was a very direct form of literary criticism, which all other poets looked at and said, I think we're going to try a different genre. And the Sufi love poem is born, and it's metaphor and the relationship to the divine as the beloved, and we have a whole thing. So fear needn't kill the story. It forces the story to react, but it needn't kill the story. Now, how does this take us to America? Well, I think it strikes me that America is one of the places, and maybe every place is like this, but one of the places where fear is running amok. Americans are terrified. As the most powerful country in the world with these giant oceans, this superpower military, the wealth beyond belief, this university, Americans are still so utterly, terrified. What happens if, Trump comes? What happens if the Russians take Ukraine? What happens if the migrants cross the border? What happens if,
And is that fear producing stories?
Well, before we producing so, but I guess what I want to come to when I see America is, in a sense, America, I think, is, to my mind, gripped by a kind of pathology of excess fear, resulting in all sorts of pathological behaviors, unfortunately, many of which are inflicted upon the rest of the world to the death of hundreds of thousands or millions of people, but also here, obviously. And so in a sense, the storytelling response that I think that summons forth and has summoned forth, throughout the American literary tradition, and I think is called for now, in a sense, America needs, kind of summoning forth of courage. Don't be so scared. Don't be so scared of me because I look this way.
Are you speaking also to American writers?
Well, I think that. Well, my sense of it is that in America, capitalism has reached its highest state of highly particularized fear dispensation. Every person is being hit by a very specific, algorithmically designed, terror-inducing set of information. And they are being scared witless. And so I think that, I mean, the rest of the world will follow. We're all, on our way there too. But here you guys are at the cutting edge.
Hang on a minute, because we're really here to discuss what literature can do about this, right?
Yeah.
So let's just put it right back to literature and story and what the possibilities of literature and story are faced with. Can we let Ece have a go and Parul?
Yeah, can we?
Sure,
Sorry. Either one of you, I'll go one and then the next. But what we are here to talk about is what are the pitfalls and the advantages of literature when it comes to trying to deal with this kind of fear that is being so successfully targeted and disseminated. Who would like to go first?
Quickly say something about this, I think. So Hannah Arendt said that stories are a cognitive tool, and they let us do two things, which is it allows you to take something that's close by and increase the distance so you can see it clearly. And it allows you to take something that's far away and bring it close so it becomes your own and it becomes intimate and becomes something you can look after. And I was listening to Mohsin and I was thinking about this idea about fear. I teach in an MFA program, it's nonfiction, and I teach students that are primarily interested in writing about their own family histories, and their own histories are deeply, deeply tangled up in the history of this country. They're really, really interested in writing, especially about class right now, I think. And there is fear, but more than that, I see them, and again, and I am a story addict and skeptic at the same time, but I see them working with story in a way that I find very heartening, in that they're using story in the sense of writers, following writers like Toni Morrison, right? Like Saidiya Hartman, who said that we can tell stories to fill absences in the archive, right? They're all writing into things that they won't know, that are not part of any archive, that aren't part of any written history in their own family or any broader national history. It's very moving work. And they're using every kind of narrative technique and strategy that I can think of to get closer, to add something to this archive, to question it, to write back into it, to keep it fluid, to keep it open and not something that gets ossified. And so this to me, I mean, in a real sense, I don't know if I can talk about Americans in a whole, but I can speak about these particular ones that are really very interested in making these particular investigations. And I loved that point that Maya, from the dialogue before we came to speak, right? And Maya had that question of what questions did your generation ask, right? And so then in this sense, I feel like this is one of the questions that I feel like this generation of younger writers are really asking, right? How do I attend to what I don't know, what has been handled badly by history? How do I re-enter it, reframe it? So this is something which I do find, really that militates against any kind of despair,
We had Viet Thanh Nguyen, author of The Sympathizer, Pulitzer Prize winner, here as our guest a few weeks ago. And he talks about something called narrative battle, the idea that you have to keep countering narratives, countering false or pre-existing or limiting narratives with narratives of your own. Is that what you're talking about? And is that something, Ece, I'd like you to react to that as well, that you recognise?
I do see it, but I also see, and I think these younger writers are following in the footsteps of a group of writers. When I think of Valeria Luiselli, I think of Teju Cole. I think we've had a generation of really interesting writers that make narrative visible, and they make us better readers. So I think when I think about this question, I work for the reader. As a critic, right? I don't work for writers, I work for the reader. And my hope and my trust is always for the readers. And I do think that we've had a generation of writers that have really tried to make visible some of the euphemisms, some of the cliches, some of the sentimental narratives. And it is a question of battling narratives, but also making the narrative technique something visible and in the room with us. So we can talk about, even as I'm making a story to supplant your story, let's also talk about what it means to have a progressive story, right? What does it mean to have this moment disjointed? What gets opened up in our own thinking?
Actually, I've got a different question for you now. This has made me think. You, and I'm paraphrasing something you said once, but so I think what Parul's talking about is critical thinking and maybe a prolonged gaze that literature can lend. You said once, and I'm paraphrasing, radio created fascism and social media is creating populism. And you talked about us in the current situation bringing 20th century tools to a 21st century debate. I mean, arguably, we're bringing 19th century tools to a 21st century debate. But I mean, is what Parul's saying possible in the big picture, that something like literature, with its ability to prolong the gaze, with its emphasis on nuance, and a mutual exchange between reader and writer, is this the right tool for now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Mohsin said it already. I mean, like, it's the story. And story is the king, and it will stay the king even if nobody reads books one day. My nephew doesn't read books. He's half American. And we had a massive fight, and I couldn't explain him why he should read books. And I said, like, I'm writing these books. And he said, you should...
For me, you just read my books.
No, you know what he said? Maybe you should look for another job. Yeah, he's half American, by the way. By the way, since yesterday, when there is a mention of America, I'm not sure if we're talking about America or capitalism. We mostly talk about capitalism, but this country is bigger than capitalism, I think. I just wanted to make this
That's an interesting
comment.
point.
Yeah. I know many people in this country who are far better critics of capitalism than myself, so that has to be, addressed, I think. At the end of the day, we do this literature thing, either reading or writing or, coming in these rooms to talk about literature, to survive beautifully. Because we know how to survive, actually, like on material basis. We get into competition, the powerful one wins, there's the loser. That's surviving. And that's not a particularly beautiful, nice way to live. So we do literature, we think about these things, whatever, we write, we tell stories to survive beautifully. As beautiful as human can be. And the other reason we do it is to resist in terms of narratives. We all come from countries, and this is another country where there is a narrative about who we are, how we should live, what is life, what is good, what is bad. So by creating our own stories, by telling the stories of the other, of course we resist to the dominant narrative. But also, by telling the story, we remember. Because one of the most important aspects of dominant narrative is to make you forget. Mm-hmm. And we write and we tell stories, and telling stories requires two persons at least, not to remember alone, not to be alone in remembering, because remembering alone is the most tragic, most maddening thing human being can experience. So this is why we do it, at the very bottom of it. But then one thing about America, capitalism, literature, or fear, basically. My windows at the hotel room don't open. I've been complaining about this since yesterday to everyone I see. And I'm asking everyone, do your windows open? I mean, like, can you open your windows? I was actually complaining about this to Rabbi Halameddin, my dear friend. And he said, Americans do not like mystery. They don't want everything. They want everything to be consistent. Sorry, Rabbi. I'm like, I didn't ask for permission to go. It is not about America, I think. It's about capitalism. It's about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism the biggest, like the most important commodity, Koe, that capitalism sells is fear of reality, I think.
Which takes us back to Mohsin.
No.
It's Mohsin's
No,
turn
I have
soon.
to finish this.
All right, finish the thought.
Fear of reality, and it advertises this story that according to our purchasing power, we can buy ourselves security. This is a great story that many people bought in this country, but then reality. This is the story we have to tell, actually, as people in literature. Reality, the remedy of fear is within reality, again. And the reason that you are so afraid of reality is that you're not close enough. You're too far. That's why it's so fearful. If you get close enough, you can see the sparkles of remedy there, the remedy for your fears. And this is the storyteller's job, to tell you the whole reality through remembering or through observing, through poetry, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
So this presumably is the idea that fiction brings you to a deeper truth rather than a literal truth. Can we unpick memorializing? Because I also want to talk about witnessing in terms of literature. And I'm thinking of something that Nadine Gordimer said. She talked about the very big difference between the first line of witness being present, the second line of witness being a commentator on TV, the third line of witness, which is the writer, right? And what the writer does is bring meaning to an event, not the fact of the event, but meaning to the event. And so I wonder, Mohsin, could you talk a bit about witnessing as opposed to memorializing, or you can talk about both, but memorializing, being the idea of not allowing something to be forgotten. But witnessing, I think, is different because that's the idea of bringing meaning.
So I was thinking, as you were asking this question and throughout part of this, conversation, why am I feeling sort of a little bit out of sorts or uncomfortable with or just unable to wrap my head around what we're talking about? And then Ece said something that sort of clicked in my head, which is something I believe in very profoundly, which is that, of course, writing or storytelling is done by two people. As a writer, what we do as a novelist, what we do is we write these half novels, and they look like letters, in black on pulped wood. And readers don't experience that, actually. Readers experience people and images and emotions, and those weren't there. What writers do is we put something there that readers take into themselves, and then readers create the experience of a book. And so, when we speak of things like what is the role, what is the ethics, what is witnessing, what are non-narrative based modes of storytelling, what is the novel, other form. To me, I'm always a little bit on shaky ground because my fundamental understanding of what being a writer is trying to establish a relationship with one reader. Not just one person, but trying to, in a sense, do my part of the dance in such a way that they have the freedom to do their part of the dance. Mm-hmm. And so I've always tried to write books that are explicitly about this, that are in fact about an awareness of the reader-writer relationship. I'll stop there because I can go on forever on this, but I think that the basic idea I'd like to, I suppose, leave you with is that I believe there's enormous fertility in that relationship. And in that fertile space, a lot of really interesting and good things can happen.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go to audience questions now. So I'm going to put these out there, and then whoever wants to pick it up is very welcome to. Otherwise, I'll choose one of you, as I do my students. Okay, number one, how can literature be leveraged to foster a sense of global citizenship among university students? Parul, would you be game for that?
How can it? I mean...
Let me give you a couple of others, actually, because there are a couple of questions which revolve around the same theme, and then we can see what we can discuss out of it. The next one is, what can be done to encourage more translations and wider dissemination of lesser-known works from the Global South in academic settings? And how can universities support students in exploring global issues through literature without imposing a Western-centric perspective? I'm sure you can take any one of our courses. And then the last one is, can literature and the flow of ideas within the Global South prevent collective amnesia and break free from Western-dominated thought, especially in a time of crisis like we're seeing in Gaza? So I think there's a lot there about bringing the Global South into the university curricula and what its impact could be.
I could take the first question, maybe.
Okay.
Which is a question that always interests me, right? Like, and I think we've been talking around it, what literature can do, what it's done for us specifically. But that question of what can it do for students? What can it do to connect? You know, I think for me, I'm always very hesitant and resistant. You know, literature is not a social worker. You know, it has its own particular ways of moving. I feel like the books that have saved me have been often written with very villainous intent. You know, it hasn't been the most sort of noble, the most noble novels necessarily. But I think that I go back to this point that the writer Jacqueline Rose once made, which is that we have to develop our mind so it can hold complexity, right? The human mind, it's not that we can automatically do it. It's not that we're born with this ability to do it. It's something that we have to continue to work on, right? To be reconstellated, to imagine. And that sometimes comes with that feeling of loss, to give yourself over to a book, to surrender to a book, to surrender to an idea. On the way here on the train, I was reading Doris Lessing, The Golden Notebook, and there's it's an amazing edition because there's her introduction sort of says that she says, I think this book has lasted because it has this spark to it, it has this energy, and that energy came from an unruly and restless place. She said, as I was writing it, I was writing myself out of one set of ideas and out of one life into another. And that to me is endlessly powerful and endlessly inviting, you know, and is not a comforting or comfortable notion, right? So I think to create that space of being with that sense of loss, of gain, of being reconstellated, of being reconfigured by what you encounter, by the idea of valorizing the encounter and what might happen in its unexpected moments, feels incredibly powerful. And then to add to the point that Mohsin was making about what the writer actually does alone in her room, right? And the text that comes to us. That notion also that the text is the vessel for the writer's own transformation and own thinking and own restlessness is incredibly powerful and important, right? So this idea, I think, that I, in my own class, try to put forth, I'm not interested as the writer as storyteller, the writer as prophet. I'm very interested in these texts as full of seething with signs and symptoms of somebody else thinking through this, you know, and staging something that we can also use, and we're invited to do that thinking along with them. So that's my soft sell.
I'm also thinking that, you know, literature taught as literature is one thing, but literature taught in the context of another subject plays a different part. I mean, I've taught a course on the literature of civil conflict, so that we're looking at civil conflict, we're looking at it through literature, which is where the memorializing, the witnessing, the giving meaning can come. But would you like to add to some of this, Ece and Mohsin?
About 2 words, actually 1 word. In the question, there was the verb bringing global south.
Let me
Why bringing?
whip through the question.
Because that bringing, since I am one of the broad ones, I can tell you that it imposes a very reducing transformation on a writer. One of the reasons I'm not still a bestseller is that I'm refusing that transformation. I'm like, you have to speak in a certain way that is expected of you. You have to act in a certain way. You have to write in a certain way, so you actually become a different person that you are expected to be. And Breitenbach, who was an exile from South Africa once, amazing poet and essayist, said, at the end, one becomes who one is expected to be. And he was also struggling with this question. So why bringing? Let's, just think about that. Ask this question. Why did we use that word there? Bringing.
I don't see the word bringing. I see leveraged. Is that?
No, there was this bringing.
Bringing.
Anyway, but
while we're
global
on bringing.
Global South thing, one of the most important realities that we are struggling, we as in, let's say, fellows of this global dialogues, is, or should be, maybe, is the brutal fact that global South, that lovely 2 words, are actually brought to table by our dictators. Before Modi, before Erdogan, before Putin, there was no global South. Mm-hmm. There was non-aligned movement in 1960s with Nasser and all the others, but 1980s, 90s, 2000s, there was no global South. And the reason that there is global South now is actually there are these guys who made their countries powerful, who brought their countries to the table. Whenever I speak, about politics and so on, there's always this big picture of Erdogan behind me, my dictator. And he's always bigger than me. And then I'm thinking, would I be here if he wasn't there? My kind of destiny is intertwined with him now. So yeah, these are the brutal facts about Global South, and this is the story that we are going to tell, I think.
Mohsin, here's one for you. Mohsin mentioned fear and suggested we should not be so scared. But don't we have so much to be afraid of globally? Climate change, threats of AI, etc. Doesn't good literature magnify and focus our fear? That's interesting, rather than...
It can. Yeah, I mean, it can do many different things. I think, partly the struggle is to take, literature and to, focus on any one part of it. There's that literature's power to focus our attention. Or literature does, I suppose, all of those things and other things. I wonder if I suppose we can. I've written books that very often have engaged with some sort of political theme. But generally, my objective has not been so much to say that this is what it is to be like a Muslim, or this is what it is to be a migrant, or this is what it is to be a white person who wakes up dark one day. I think I've been interested in what happens when you destabilize these things by having a reader and a writer give birth to a creative imagining of something together. So if we both imagine what it's like to wake up like this, or if we both imagine this story together, and the story is not entirely determined, and you at the end, the reader, are left with a sense of how much of this came from me and how much of this came from the writer. And to the extent that some of it came from me, what does it mean about me? I think, I suppose in that sense, I imagine literature at working at quite a micro level of like one reader and one writer. Now, of course, those readers and writers, add up. But I think that I imagine literature in the sense, not in the way that literature is. I imagine literature in the way that I need it to be. What happens to me when I read a book? Why do I read books? I read books to have this kind of experience, to sort of be myself and not myself at the same time, and to be kind of something else, something with potential.
Okay, well, here's a question that's just not going to let you get away with that.
Yeah.
So, Parul Sehgal referred to interrupting cliches as one office of the writer. Can the panel speak to the material forces and structures of power that attempt to enforce cliches and that profit by the maintenance of such cliches? And what means are used to enforce them? And how those means may be resisted?
Yes, tell us.
You know what? That
an
question,
amazing
together
question.
with your amazingly beautiful accent, I feel like I'm in House of Lords. I was in House of Lords. It sounds like this. You are the New Yorker staff writer.
No. As Parul Sehgal posed the question, please.
Come
I didn't
on,
understand
think this is
the question.
the nub of our discussion. I'm going to read it again. Parul Sehgal referred to interrupting cliches as one office of the writer. Interrupting cliches as one office of the writer. Can the panel speak to the material forces and structures of power, capitalism, presumably, that attempt to enforce cliches and that profit by the maintenance of such cliches? And what means are used to enforce them, and how those means might be resisted.
Oh, I understand. Did you understand?
I think so.
I understood it.
Go on, then.
Did I? Actually, I don't know who asked the question. I really want to see the face, but if you don't want to be seen.
Hi.
I'm writing a book right now, and I wrote a sentence. I thought it wouldn't mean anything to another person, but then my editor said, I love this sentence. And the sentence was almost a cliche. Not a cliche, but I just wrote, writing happens in an enclave of truthfulness. We talked about moral responsibility and so on. I don't know why people write to reproduce these cliches, because there's no joy in it. So I don't understand how people live without joy, to be honest. Because writing, if there is no joy, that actually Mohsin mentioned this experience, which I call joy, if there is no joy, writing is just literally physical torture. It is. You sit like this or whatever, like it is a physical torture. And there is a price to pay if you choose the joy, I think. But then that price, actually, let me put it this way, everybody pays the price that they can. This is the price that I can pay, living a comfortable life, let's say. I can pay that price. Being without joy, I cannot pay that price. It's too much for me. So everybody chooses a price. This is how we, make our moral choices, actually. There is no big morality. Everybody does what they can. I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but this is how I understood it.
You going to have a go?
Yeah, so the phrase interrupting cliches as a responsibility of the writer comes from the great queer historian Douglas Crimp. And so I think I would answer that question kind of drawing on what you said earlier too, right? Which is the idea of forgetting. And I think the cliches that I'm most interested in seeing interrupted are the things, or it's like I'm interested in seeing what's bringing us, making us attentive to what we no longer notice, right? So when you're talking about capitalism, how to make that visible. And one of the ways that I see profoundly is the ability of the writer to show and to imagine, taking us back to our job of imagining things together, what is no longer there, right? What's not there yet, because it hasn't been imagined, and to imagine it seems so big and so audacious. This is something the writer can do. They can say it's not just, might is right. It's not, these things are not inevitable. We can still imagine other things. So there's that idea, but then there's the ability of the writer to also imagine and see what's no longer there because it has been suppressed or forgotten, concealed. So in these ways, so I think I'm also slightly dancing around your question, but I think that this ability of the writer to see what's not there yet or what was once there feels to me at the heart of
Or to
something.
see what's hidden in plain sight.
Yes, yeah, which is like, and then you look again and we can have that conversation, and as many have, about like the role of style, right? That there's a certain way that style and technique makes the reader notice what gets so neatly elided. And there's like a whole tradition of great writers about aesthetics and style who said that this is why difficulty becomes important. This is why shattered narratives become important. This is why mosaics become important, because then we break our sense of believing that certain stories bend in certain directions all the time, that certain forms of justice are necessarily going to prevail, et cetera, et cetera.
Mohsin, would you like to talk about form a bit, actually? I'd be interested to hear what you think about form and revealing what is hidden or what is hidden in plain sight. Because your novels have, go into the unreal, deviate from the realistic, and why in particular you choose that kind of form? Or is it just something that, I don't know, you just feel like doing on a Sunday?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting because so many of these questions, for me, to discuss them in the abstract, I feel like I'm not sure exactly what I'm talking about. It's a lot. So if you want me to talk about form, I have to be specific. In my first novel, Moth Smoke, it's a trial in which you, the reader, are cast as the judge, and the main characters will tell you sort of their version of the story, and you will encounter this thing. And my idea was, I suppose, to try to have the reader be aware of being a character in this, to be aware of judging the proceedings, to be a kind of co-conspirator in making up this weird novel, and to be a trial, in a sense, of a type of person. With an unclear judgment. And I was writing like that because I was trying to figure out, in a sense, what I felt about this place. I'd lived in Lahore, I'd gone away. Like, what do I make of this? I'm not sure. Let me sit with the reader and try to figure it out. And then in my second novel, The Rutland Fundamentalist, it's told like a dramatic monologue where characters tell you his story. You are this unnamed, presumably American character who never gets to speak, we don't hear from. And the reason for that particular form was that it was a half story. And I felt in this sort of post-9/11 world, we were being a sort of bombardment of half stories. Particularly if one lived in London or New York, as I did, these sort of half stories from here about over there, and you'd never hear from over there. I thought, let me do the reverse, where you're only hearing from over there. And again, give you a half story, and once again, force you to judge what's going on, and then to be left, in a sense, with a kind of mirror. Anyway, I won't go through all my books like this, but the point is, I'm wary of Ece kicking me in the shin if I keep doing this. But the short, both are enough. But I think for me, form is a way to intervene on the stage on which the reader-writer relationship will be enacted. And different kinds of relationships, different kinds of stories are best suited, in my mind, to different stages that change the stance we have towards each other. And so that's really how I approach, I guess, form in novels.
We've got a couple more questions and a little bit more time. I just wonder if either of you have a comment about form before we... I'm thinking about, I took a plane and I was sitting next to a Romanian guy and he was talking about having lived under the Ceausescu regime and how, how many books were censored, withdrawn, and they couldn't get their hands on very much literature. And he became an aficionado of science fiction. And he said to me, everything I know about how totalitarianism works came from reading science fiction. And science fiction was the only thing to slip through the net under the Ceausescu regime, because he said they just thought they were stupid made-up stories in stupid made-up worlds. So form has its place. Do you have any thoughts about form before?
Well, I'm watching a lot of Netflix.
So film does. As opposed to...
Everyone does. No, seriously, I think all this, cultural differences thing is a little bit overrated. At the end of the day, go to any city in any city on the world. After a while, when there's this awkward silence, somebody says, "So what did you watch lately?" And then somebody talks about this series and so on. And there is a form, and I think it has been perfected with Succession, with Mad Men, several others. No, it is a form, and stories. They're amazing stories, amazing storytelling, and so on. But then this form thing is more your thing, probably, a critique's thing. Those, I don't know. I'm not thinking about form. I wrote 3 novels. Two of them are in English. Women Who Blow on Nuts and The Time of Meets Ones. And Women Who Blow on Nuts is 4 women hitting the road during Arab Spring. Weird story. And I wrote it to survive, literally. I lost my job, I lost my everything. I'm in Tunis. They're trying to burn down the district I'm living in. I'm drinking wine and I'm writing while listening to Kulthum. So I didn't think about form. It's just, it has to be so energetic that it has to make me forget everything. But then Time of Meets Ones, it was a goodbye to my country, so it's a completely different form. But then form is not my interest, let's say. I'm not thinking about it, I'm just doing it. Somebody else has to. This is how I feel, at least. Somebody else has to think about it.
No, but that makes sense, right? It's so close to the story you want to tell and how it's coming out and how it's shaped, right? So I think that makes sense. And it gets to be the reader's or the critic's pleasure in saying that this is what I see, this is what I think is happening, and this is what I think it means. The only thing I would add to form is that another book that I would recommend anybody who's thinking about form and how to stage and place some of these political questions and some of these unanswerable questions and notions of what still feels unsayable. There's this great book called Migrant Aesthetics. I don't know if people have heard of it. By Migrant Aesthetics by Glenda Carpio. She's a scholar at Harvard. And I was reading it, and it's really just about and it's about the climate crisis, right? It's about how are writers writing their way into these sorts of questions? How are they rejecting, as we said, this narrative battle? What stories are they interested in rewriting, rethinking about? But it felt really exciting, and it makes it local, which I think is the thing that we're also all talking about, that these matters are difficult to talk about in the abstract, but show us a sentence, show us a text, and we can really feel much more tethered to some of these bigger questions.
One last sentence, may I add? One last sentence. What we are going through in the world is this polycrisis, as we call it, is absolutely incomprehensible for human mind. And the only way to explain and make sense of it is poetic understanding, like embracive poetic understanding. So this is actually the ultimate answer to your question, what can literature do? It can help us understand this incomprehensible thing, I guess.
Well, we've got time for one more question. I think this one has been answered, actually, so I'm going to move on to another one. The question for Parul: in this discussion of story writ large, is there a particular piece of recent writing that represents a way forward in a divided world?
What's the question?
In this, I'm going to give you two questions at once. Okay, for Parul, in this discussion of story writ large, is there a particular piece of recent writing that to you represents, in inverted commas, a way forward in a divided world? I'm going to let you think about that for a moment while I ask the other two. Ece mentioned the stories, that stories can bring different narratives together and keep us from killing each other. I think you said the opposite.
Yeah.
She said people go to battle over stories,
But
but never
my
mind.
English is so bad.
Let's turn it around. The question is, are there great novels out there that can stop us going to war with each other?
Yeah, Catch-22. One of them being. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask each of you to answer either of those questions as you can: a way forward in a divided world, or great novels out there that can stop us killing each other. And I'll leave you with a question of my own, actually. You know, I was sitting in this room last week listening to astrobiologists who were having a conference about the climate crisis, but they were looking at it from a sort of intergalactic point of view. And to a woman and man, they asked for artists to become engaged in this question. That the only people who could, and this speaks to your point, the only people in their view that could transmit the level of this crisis and the complexity of this crisis across were artists, not just writers, but fine artists, musicians, artists of all kinds. So I'm going to leave us with that. Can anyone, and if you can't answer the question of a particular piece of writing that would stop us going to war, or
I can answer.
that would be great, or a way forward in a divided world, would you give us a book that's changed you?
Wow. Look, there are several, but then it wouldn't work for people here, probably. It was a particular time, particular. But
Well, there was a little black fish.
obviously, I'm like there are several others, but there's one book that's a great story. It's called Dawn of Everything. It's about human history, basically. But then human history, as we know it, is a story anyway. So this is the story that kind of reverses the story, and David Graeber and David Wengrow came together and rewrote the human history, saying that maybe what we know about ourselves has been completely wrong. So here's what could have happened, or what actually happened. So that is a very, very inspiring book about future, although it's about human history. So I would highly recommend that, of course.
Mohsin?
Okay, two-part answer very briefly. In terms of books that try to stop us from killing each other, I won't say great books, but books that try to stop us from killing each other, that's what a lot of what I'm trying to do. You know, The Last White Man, Button Fundamentalist, Exit West are sort of about that. Now, for a great book, I would recommend Antonio Tabucchi's Sustaina Pereira, which you'll find either translated as Pereira Declares or as Pereira Maintains. Either translation. It's actually the same translation with two different titles. I don't know why that happened. Same translator. Superb novel. It has form. It has love. It has the arrival of fascism. You know, it has so much to delight us in reading closely and in interest. So I recommend it highly to all of you.
Thank you. And Parul?
Yeah, to the question about sort of, given sort of story skepticism, what would I recommend? It's a book by Christina Sharp. It's called Ordinary Notes. And I would recommend it not just because it is really interesting and thoughtful on the level of form, and how it wants to tell a different story about the afterlives of slavery, right? A story that has no end. How do you tell a story without an end? But because it also is a great example of how do you think with the people who have shaped you, who you now reject, specifically your intellectual former heroes or your ancestors. How do you continue that conversation, even though you are now thinking past them, or you were wounded by something they once said or wrote, or helped you now perceive? So it's a beautiful way of, like, again, to go back to one of the first questions you asked, against that kind of binary thinking, right? How do we still, continue that conversation?
Well, thank you very much indeed. It gives us something practical to do with our time. Thank you very much, Parul Sehgal, Ece Temelkuran, and Mohsin Hamid. And thank you so much to all of you. You've been great. Thanks for your questions.